Bias in the media, an all too familiar topic. It seems to have permeated every aspect of our national discourse, relegating honest reporting to a distant memory of days gone by. The press, which used to be the last bastion of hope, truth, and justice in America, has been relegated to an entity in which getting the facts right seems to take a back seat to getting the facts that you want. But how prevalent is this bias? And more importantly, how dangerous is it? Hi, my name is Steve Monteiro, former Secret Service agent, military veteran, and author. Join me as we attempt to unpack these issues and answer the question, what happened to the press? Hi, I'm Steve Monteiro, and thank you for joining. Today, I am pleased to say I have a special guest on our show, Mr. Bill Outlaw, and we're going to be talking about a very important topic to both of us, and that is the bias in the media and how dangerous it has become. But before I turn it over to Bill, I just want to briefly talk about some of his background. He's had decades of experience in journalism and in politics, so I thought that was just a perfect nexus for talking about the subject at hand. But before we get into it, I just want to talk very briefly about how I met Bill. We both attended a screening for an excellent movie called Lonesome Soldier. And I highly recommend it to people because it really does cover a very important topic, and that is the plight of our veterans and how they deal with PTSD and how difficult it is, not only for the veterans, but also for their families. And I'm not going to lie, it's a very dark topic, but obviously a very important one. And I had the chance to meet the star of that movie, Alexander Randazzo, and I was just very impressed with how much support he has given to the veterans and how committed he was to actually making this movie to get out this important subject. So I just recommend people, if you have a chance, to go see it. It's called The Lonesome Soldier. But anyway, I met Bill at that function, and I don't know how it happened, but we started talking about bias in the media, and it just was a very passionate subject for both of us. So at the end of that, I said, boy, given Bill's experiences in journalism and in politics and public affairs, what a great guest he would make to talk about this subject. So anyway, Bill, welcome to the show, and I'm glad to have you.
And thanks, Steve, for having me on. And first off, just to reaffirm what you said, that's a very powerful, great movie, and I hope anybody that gets a chance to watch it will be able to do so. I think they're going to try to stream it later, but Lonesome Soldier deals with an issue that's also dear to my heart because I'm a veteran, and I've dealt with veterans with PTSD and stuff. So anyway, now the other part of that, I find it always that you have to admit myself, you said I have decades of experience. And I said, but gee, Steve, I'm only 35. Come on.
Yeah, that makes two of us. So I didn't give the exact number. I just said decades. So you got a little, yeah. So, go ahead. Yeah. So why don't you just take a moment, Bill, to further introduce yourself and talk about some of those experiences. I think our listeners would love to hear it.
Right. Great. Thanks, Steve. Yeah, my background is, we'll keep it fairly simple, but it actually does include decades of experience. I started as a journalist in South Carolina, where I'm from originally, in 1975. So I guess that does make up for a few things. And I got a BA in journalism and a master's in mass communications at the University of South Carolina. Went from there to work on several newspapers in South Carolina. Then evolved to working started as a stringer for the Associated Press in South Carolina, and was offered a full-time job for them and worked for them for several years, both in the South Carolina and North Carolina Bureau. I'd always wanted to live and work as a journalist in Washington, D.C., so I finally just kind of took off and said, okay, I'm moving to Washington. And when I came to Washington, I had some mutual contacts that ended up working at the Washington Times. And I had never thought that I would end up working there. Because this will get into the bias a little bit, because I had heard, that it had a conservative bias. God forbid, you know.
Yeah.
But I had some mutual contacts there, did the interview, and they basically offered me a job on the spot. And through that, I was able to do some reporting firsthand for them and got a chance to ultimately cover the State Department and Foreign Affairs for them, which really was a terrific opportunity. And I started regularly covering State Department briefings and interviewing officials from all over the world that came into Washington for various purposes. And so it really, opened a door for me. And this was also during the quote-unquote Cold War era. And so, and in fact, that in and of itself kind of lends itself to a bias that was going on even at that time. But from there, I ended up switching to political jobs. I worked in public affairs with several federal agencies in the Reagan administration, and then later in the George W. Bush administration. I also worked on the presidential campaign and for U.S. Senator and for a nonprofit. So part of the reason I give that is I've had broad experience across the range, both in being a reporter and in these other jobs in dealing with the media. And that has impacted greatly what my view is, because I first came into journalism thinking, no, this is right for me. I can be objective and call it like it is and report on the facts as they are. And that's the way I started out and thinking that way. And when I was working at the Associated Press, if I had ever tried to inject opinion or kind of present myself as an advocate in any way, I wouldn't have kept my job. I would have been, the AP at that time was very, very much all about objectivity and fairness. And it still is something that's drilled in to my DNA, because I still consider myself, as I harken back to my journalism days and, doing freelance and doing a blog and things of that nature, I still kind of consider myself what now would be called the old school type of journalist, which would be, straightforward reporting. You don't put your opinion in. You may have an opinion, but part of the idea is that you consciously work to keep your opinion out of the story and therefore give both sides.
Sure, absolutely. And we had a previous pretty fervent discussion on this when we met earlier. And it's just an incredible situation that we find ourselves in with the media. And I'm not exactly sure, when it happened. I think you brought up a good point in our conversation that we all have biases. It's part of the human condition. We can't get away from that. But when you let those biases affect what is supposed to be, honest journalism, it really it has an effect. And that's what I really would like to get into in a bit. Is not only the bias that the media has, and by the way, this is on both sides. So this is not an issue of Democratic versus Republican or conservative versus liberal. It's just it's a conversation about the dangers of bias, regardless from what point you come from, because people take this information, this news, and then they act upon it, and that's where the danger comes in. So I don't know if you can talk about when you first saw that this was kind of moving in that direction and how we got away from. I'm old enough to remember when there was, I guess you could say, straight reporting, where reporters had their stories fact checked, and they had editors that basically made certain that they were reporting the right things the right way. But somewhere along the line that shifted. So maybe you can talk about what was your first impressions on when that may have happened.
Right. And just to reaffirm your point, like you said, everybody has an opinion or a point of view, but the key point when I started in journalism was that you consciously worked not to include your viewpoint. And I think we'll get more into the evolution of things, but today's journalists are now deliberately referred to themselves as advocacy journalists, and their point of view is front and center, which they would argue is more fair to the listener or the viewer, because they're admitting their bias up front as opposed to hiding it. but we'll get more into that as I go along. But back to the evolution. When I moved to Washington and ended up at the Washington Times, and here again, I'd come from a background of objectivity, and when I covered the Washington Times, which, as you know, has a conservative viewpoint, and still exists and still is pretty conservative. There's no question about that. But one of the things that journalism always tries to preach, or you grow up with, is you have your news reporting is where you have objective, straightforward, fact-based reporting, and if you have opinions, they're on the opinion page. And that all of that now has changed because opinions are right out front. But that's the approach that I took, and I started working, and I viewed myself as that objective journalist, and I was working at the Washington Times covering foreign affairs. And like I said, this was during a period of the Cold War, and so I was going down and hearing briefings and interviews about communism and the impact of what's happening throughout the world. It was a great opportunity for me to have. But I started working on stories that would be based on straightforward reporting on my part, and that were also covered by reporters, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the networks. And I would go back and I would write my story as a fact-based, straightforward reporter as that I viewed myself as, and I go back and I'd see their stories, and I go, "Whoa, that's not what I saw or heard. Where did that come from?" So I started kind of looking at things as in a different light, because I still wanted to be that objective journalist, and then I saw that others weren't doing that, and then now this was still quite some time ago, but I think things have greatly evolved since then, and because even then a lot of journalists still presented themselves as being objective, even though they really did have a bias, which is what I was running into.
Sure. So it seems to me that, and again, we spoke about this previously, that I would say that the media in general was slanted more towards the left. I have that sense. And of course, I think that things have gotten really bad in the era of Trump with fake news and all of the things that were talked about. But I think really now it's at a point where it's gone beyond just a situation of being biased and being slanted in that direction that may, weave itself into your story, right? That's how it generally works. But today it is right in your face, clearly biased, and the effects of it are just really detrimental to the United States, because there was a time that I remember when we would look at the media, at journalists, as the last bastion of truth. They were that was the wall that we could always count on to help us out, whether it was against a corrupt government or a corporation or whatever. The media could be counted on to get the truth and put that out there for the benefit of the American people, because a free and an open and honest press is so important to any democracy. And it just seems that is now gone. And I don't know exactly, like you said, it just was probably a gradual thing, but it's really reached, I guess, a fever pitch in the last couple of years, where it is really noticeable. And so many reports are put out there and then later fact-checked to be incorrect. But there seems to be no consequence or ramifications for that. Do you see it that way as well?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think just to reaffirm your point, I mean, it did evolve, but in the era of Trump, it's really become very blatant. And as you well know, I mean, I think your viewers here would see, anywhere you go, there's either certain outlets and networks that are all anti-Trump all the time, and there's not enough. I mean, they categorically state anything that Donald Trump does is bad or fake news or not to be believed or slanted, and this guy's a threat to our society. And I've observed that too. Now I try to still take a step back, say, look, I'm not trying to be pro-Trump or anti-Trump in the context of still presenting things, but you can't help but notice that. And on the other side, like you said, there are conservative outlets, i.e. Fox News, Newsmax, and some others that actually are more on the pro-conservative, pro-Trump side, but many, many more are on the liberal side. And to the point of documenting this, I mean, one of the things I'm doing now with my blog, independentlaw.com, and I'm still in development of that, but I cite polls that have been taken about media bias that have been done by reputable polling organizations, Gallup, Knight Ridder, people like that who do and have tracked media bias over a long period of time. And those polls show that public opinion about the media, the public actually strongly views the media, as being biased for the most part. And so it's really evolved. And like I said, I don't think we went from point A to where we are now right away, but it became more evident in the Trump era, I think, as teams or outlets started taking positions that either they were pro-Trump or anti-Trump. So these polls, they tracked. These are not just recent. This type of tracking has been going on for quite some time, and the polls show that trend has in fact been increasing. And I think the challenge that it brings, Steve, that you alluded to, is that the public is still out there, and for the most part, I think they really want something that's credible, that's believable, that they can turn to and say, I see what they're saying. It's a straightforward, fact-based, truth-based approach, or at least it's not slanted. And those same polls are showing that the public now is no longer viewing the media as having that type of credibility, that they recognize that there is a bias in a lot of the reporting. And I think that's part of the big problem with it, is I still think there's a lot of people out there, and polling does validate this, a lot of people out there who still would like to have a more straightforward type of news operation. And this, of course, gets into the whole political dynamic, which we're into now. So
Sure. It's interesting. You mentioned the polling, and I'm doing my research for this segment. There was a Gallup poll that basically said 40% of Americans have no faith in the media. And I was just shocked, because it wasn't, we think they have a bias. It was no faith in the media at all, which was, just very disheartening to read that. But I could see how that could happen. And one of the things I wanted to get your opinion on, when you look at the national news, so I'm not talking about local news stations, but national news, it's hard to find an actual news program. Everything is commentary. However, they talk about news items, but they couch themselves as commentary. So when you look at, for example, Rachel Maddow or Sean Hannity or Laura Ingraham or, Anderson Cooper, they talk about things that are in the news. So they come off as journalists and news reporters, but their shows are technically commentary. And I think that is a blending that is very confusing to people, because they look to them to be the news outlet, because there's so many of them. I mean, on Fox News, there's like 7 shows in a row, and they're all commentary, and it makes it difficult, because that seems to be where now you're getting your news from on the national level.
Yeah, and you're right, and that's what has evolved. Is it's no longer. I mean, these shows, that, like I said, they're based on what's happening in the news, but it's really mostly about their opinion about the news. And of course, in presenting that opinion, they bring in or have guests that basically are in alignment or affirm their own opinion. So it becomes even more slanted that way. And by the same token, they'll ignore or not have representatives from, quote, the other side. But I think I'll go back a little bit to trace the evolution, if you will, keep it simple. But I think today's world, we see, like I said, all over the place, you have those type of shows, the commentary. There's all kinds of media outlets out there now that weren't out there 40 years ago when we first started getting into this. I mean, it used to be that your news you only had three primary networks: ABC, CBS, and NBC. Then you had maybe a PBS outlet. You had your local outlets, and you had the Associated Press wire service, and you had your national paper. But the point is that that's where people got their news. They didn't have this extensive network of all of these different shows, many of which deliberately take these viewpoints. And that evolved, in my opinion, with the evolution of cable news starting out. People, kind of hard for some people to know, but I mean, CNN really only started becoming a big major force. It was like the big thing with Ted Turner. Oh my gosh, 24-hour news coverage. How can they do that? Well, they started out, and this was like the early 1980s when they really started getting their footing. So it hasn't been around forever. So they started out all news all the time, and then you had more and more cable outlets started evolving. And with that, you had more and more of these opinion shows that would start cropping up, so that it wasn't just a news show being presented. It was like opinion. A classic example there would be something like Crossfire. That Crossfire came on, and it was presented, and they tried to present it. A Crossfire was they would have a liberal and a conservative on the show, and therefore presenting the liberal and conservative viewpoints. So that kind of started the road. Once they went down that road, you had Crossfire, and then all of a sudden, all of these other cable outlets started getting similar shows, and then you had more and more shows coming about with this left-right, and then more and more started doing more going toward panels, and oftentimes, having their panel discussions about the news, and all of a sudden it quit being so much left versus right, but more like, okay, this is our viewpoint. Don't you agree, sir? It's like, yeah. So I think a lot of that happened, and then you go on into the internet era, which of course further expanded the availability of different types of outlets until today's dynamic with social media. And oh my gosh, I mean, it's gone crazy. And I think the social media environment has really taken it to another level. The bias level has always been there to a degree, but now it is, it's in your face, and all you got to do is
Sure.
for a while is
You're right.
one way or the other.
Sure.
So
I think you touched on a really good point there, and I just want to expand on it, and that is the way we get our news today. As you mentioned, it was basically three national news outlets: ABC, CBS, NBC back in the day, and you had the major newspapers and the print media. But today, there's so many avenues in which we get information, and it comes fast and furious. And I think that lends itself to making a lot of errors, because if you're not first with the story, then you're last with the story. And I think there's a great deal of pressure to get that information out there, because in the day of social media and where information just can explode around the world in just a matter of minutes, you need to get that story out there. And I think that type of pressure lends itself to making a lot of mistakes. So let's get it out there, and we'll worry about whether it's right later on. And now where nobody seems to care if they do make a mistake, and if they wind up apologizing for it, it happens like on the 10th page somewhere, buried in there, and they just go on. So I think that's a big part of it too, the way we get the information, and from so many different sources today, that it changes the whole dynamic of reporting. The days of working a story and working it, and then sitting down with your editor and fact checking it and making sure it's right before you put it out there seems to have gone by the wayside because of the nature of the reporting and the way information is reported today. It makes that type of old school method just archaic, I guess. And we've got a situation now where mistakes are just very common.
And absolutely. And there again, going back to affirm that, my days of the Associated Press, the wire service, which, as you know, wire services feed other media outlets throughout the country. So they kind of set the agenda at the table for everybody all across the country to get their news. Whereas now, if I want to tweet something, I can, get tweeting. If I get enough followers and if I add to things, I can put whatever I want, whenever I want. And, it's up to me how much I check it or how I present it. But it really took off, and you still have a lot of people now. The premium is, let's get it out there first. We want to be the first. We want to have that exclusive and nobody else has. We want to get it. I'm back to my days at AP. Our big competitor at the time was United Press International and Reuters to a certain extent as a wire service. But we always, as an AP reporter, we were pushed to say, boy, you better not let a UPI beat you. But saying that, your story better be accurate. So you did have a little bit in those days of kind of saying, okay, we want it first, but we want it accurate. But now a lot of that accuracy aspect has gone out the window, and people are the big thing is let's get it first. And like we discussed a little bit before, and I think people viewing this program can relate to the kind of situation that's happened with reporting on the stories involving the terrorists, Hamas, and the Israeli situation. We talked about this. The horrific attack by Hamas was just incredible. But the aftermath of that, of course, was that Israel, as Hamas had projected, was going to strike back. So they start attacking different outlets in Gaza. And one of the things that happened there is Hamas then put out that Israel had attacked this hospital where you had children and patients and civilians and all of this kind of stuff. And they put it out that Israel was the one that attacked it. There were explosions there and people were dying from that. So
Sure.
Immediately, Hamas puts it out. And what's happened, and what should have been the case, is the media outlets sit there and go, oh, wait a minute, Hamas, these guys are terrorists, they're anti-Israel, we should at least check them out, see what they're saying, right? Now, for the most part, that story got out originally as Hamas fed it to the media, and it went all over the place that it was Israel that had perpetrated that. And that's the classic, and that's the danger of it, because as subsequent reporting comes in, it says, well, guess what? It wasn't Israel after all that did these type of attacks. But that gets a little lost now because the initial story is all over the place that it was Israel that was doing this.
Sure. It's amazing because, I did some research on that as well. And again, as you mentioned, we previously spoke about this, but I was just shocked at the news agencies that ran with that story without any fact checking, without even waiting. If they had just waited a matter of a few hours, they would have gotten more information that perhaps what Hamas was telling them was incorrect. And we were talking like Reuters, AP, just you get major news organizations, the BBC, these are all major organizations that know how to do it right. They've been in the news business for forever. And for them to run with that story so quickly, blaming the attack on Israel, was not only irresponsible, it was dangerous. Because as you mentioned, as a result of that, and that story went around the world, and there were protests everywhere. There were violent protests. Our embassies were attacked. It wasn't just a matter of a story that had, some bias to it. There were consequences of running that story that way, and very dangerous consequences. And that is my big issue. It's that the media just does not seem to either care or understand the consequences of biased reporting, or even in this case, false reporting, and they just seem to, go with the flow. And I think that example that you just brought up about the Hamas-Israeli situation is a perfect example of exactly what we were talking about earlier.
Right. And like you said, it feeds one thing and starts with that. Then it feeds in, as you pointed out, to the demonstrations which were taking place, London, Paris, all over the United States, which I found amazing, the degree of the demonstrations that were taking place so quickly. I mean, right immediately. And the demonstrations, basically, most of it was about taking a pro-Gaza, pro-Palestine viewpoint, but a lot of it was really tied into what Hamas had done. And that together, there again, the lines were blurred so that these students, in many cases throughout the country and the states, they were basically articulating the pro-Palestine Gaza independent, these poor states have been dominated by Israel's kept them from their independence, and, they have a right to their own freedom, etc. Totally, basically moving past the fact that Hamas had been attacking Israel and did this incredible, terrible incident. But, I mean, Hamas has been attacking Israel for many, many years. They routinely fire missiles over there all the time. And
Sure.
there's something, but it appeals to these people who don't really, many of them don't know any better in that context. But that's actually the danger that we're talking about here, is they're getting out and demonstrating and protesting, in this case, against Israeli occupation, their suppression of the Palestinians, and that's the viewpoint that's taken in a lot of the stories. And the media then, of course, in turn, are covering these demonstrations. And what are they reporting? They're reporting what the demonstrations say, what they do. And they basically, the whole idea, this whole thing was started by Hamas, gets kind of lost and diluted. And
Absolutely. That's a perfect point. It got lost and diluted. But I also think, too, that these terrorist organizations like Hamas, like Hezbollah, and like others realize the importance of the media, realize the importance of PR, realize the importance of getting this out, because there's no doubt in my mind that Hamas, just ginned this thing up and had made outreaches, and because these demonstrations just happened very, very quickly, and they were everywhere, and they seem to be in lockstep with the general media. And so it seems to me that they've caught on to the power of social media. They've caught on to the power of messaging and how important that is. And they got ahead of this. And I think this is the results that we're seeing, where, the damage is done, right? So regardless of whether the BBC, Reuters, AP, UPI, they come out later and report that, okay, it was a rocket that was fired by Hamas that just missed its target. But the damage is done. And that's the dangerous part of it, because you can't recover from that type of damage, because some people just need that information. They're just waiting for that. They're just waiting for that type of thing to just run with. And you could see that the results of it, not only in the United States, but around the world, when you have that type of bad reporting, and then we're dealing with the after effects of it. So it's really just devastating. But I wanted to ask you this real quickly. So, I think we both talked about the fact that, in general, our higher institutions have always been slanted left. Our, higher education has been in that direction, and the media as well. But there was a time when journalists, even though they had that maybe bias, and they had the, I guess you could say, left-leaning or right-leaning, whatever, that they would go to work for either print media or, some other type of news organization. But there was always editors there. There were always referees that would, bring them back and make sure that they did the right thing. That seems to be gone. And I think you mentioned it, and I'd like you to talk about the New York Times situation, in which, that was just incredible. So please go ahead and enlighten us.
Right. And just to, again, reaffirm, you touched on it already, but Hamas planned their attacks. They knew that they were going to get the media coverage. And that's also why not just their attacks, but they took hostages as a result. And that leads into the day. They took those hostages because they knew that would continue to get them the attention that they wanted to their issue. And then the storyline becomes about the hostages they're taking. And why are they taking these hostages? Well, Hamas and Palestinians have been oppressed. But, that just feeds into that aspect. But back to your stuff, the New York Times, which is considered by journalists, that's the bastion of the prima donna of news gathering organizations and institutions. It has been for many, many years. And other journalists look to it as kind of being the trendsetter for what is really and truly news and how it's reported. And the New York Times does a lot of great reporting even now. But if you get into certain types of issues, that's where you get really political. And this is what happened several years ago, if people now remember. Another wave of demonstrations took place with Black Lives Matter throughout the country. And, it was a terrible situation there of the policeman killing George Floyd. And understandably, people were upset. But then these demonstrations took place nationwide quickly, and all of a sudden, a lot of them started becoming violent. There were people that were, in some places either intimidating or outright attacking police and other people who were there at the scene. So what happened during that period is a Republican senator, Tom Cotton of Arkansas, who's definitely considered by the media a hardliner or right-winger, which if they say that right away, we're saying, oh, by the way, this guy's really out there, He's not. But Cotton had written an op-ed that was run in the New York Times, and he basically said in that op-ed that the military intervention needed to come in and kind of quell some of this violence. Now, you can agree or disagree, or one can agree or disagree with what Cotton is saying there, but the idea, it's an opinion, and it was on the, quote, op-ed page of the New York Times. The idea behind an op-ed page is op-ed stands for opposite the editorial, and that's exactly what it was. And so most newspapers in their op-ed opinion pieces often have opposing viewpoints of lots of different stripes. But in this case, it was this conservative talking about the military needs to come in and clean this stuff up. I'm simplifying his argument.
Sure.
But at any rate, what happened there is the New York Times newsroom, who is basically pretty much liberal in their thinking, and again, they do a lot of great reporting, but certain issues especially are very biased, and we can get more into that in, but this being an example of one of them. But the newsroom got upset that the New York Times opinion page editor had actually run this editorial by Senator Cotton. So they got up and they protested to the New York Times and the opinion page editor and objecting to it being run. Ultimately, they got it, the op-ed had to be taken down, and the opinion page editor, again, keyword there, opinion page editor, got fired for running Senator Cotton's op-ed. You really think about that. It's just,
that's amazing, because you think that's the purpose of an op-ed, right? So what is it? What's their mindset now? You can write an op-ed and we'll run it as long as you agree with us. So I mean that's the whole purpose of an op-ed. Like you said, it's the opposition side of it. So yeah, that was a perfect example of how just how infected the some elements of our media have become, where they've just been taken over. It's like the animals are running the zoo, I guess, an analogy. But to your point, and I want to talk about this for a minute or two, when you mentioned the George Floyd incident, and obviously I have my own feelings about that, and it was an unfortunate incident all the way around, but I won't get into the specifics of the George Floyd case, except to the point of the fact that the national media ran with that like like nothing I've ever seen. And they painted this horrible picture of this anti-police narrative that just blew right across the entire country. It was all kinds of media outlets just reporting on this nonstop, painting this picture that the police were going around and killing African Americans and brutalizing them. And obviously, if you looked at the FBI statistics, it will tell you that did not happen. This did not take place. However, the narrative of the media just went wild with this anti-police, and look at the results of it. This is what I'm getting back to in terms of understanding that when you either false report, or you're sloppy in your reporting, or you're biased in your reporting, the effects are absolutely devastating, because this anti-police narrative has caused massive problems within our country. Crime rates are up. The police are leaving. They're retiring in droves. I just read an article the other day, NYPD is down. So many officers, they've had it. They've had it with the anti-police narrative. They've had it with prosecutors that don't want to prosecute crime. They've been told by the higher-ups to basically lay off of these criminals. They're hiring, DAs are getting elected, I should say, that don't want to prosecute. It is all based upon this anti-police narrative that started, and the consequences are absolutely devastating, with crime just spiking in so many places. And now they're finally realizing the errors of their ways, and they are trying to recruit more officers because they realized they had messed up. But it's becoming a real serious problem to attract anyone to that business. So that's what I'm talking about, the ramifications of this, either bias reporting, false reporting, or just plain being wrong.
Oh, absolutely. And just, again, your point is that, that was, 2-3 years ago now, the George Floyd. And now here we are, and now you have another wave of demonstrations that came about as a result of the terrorist incident of what we were talking about. And here again, by the same token, you got a lot of vandalizing going on and things tied in to those particular demonstrations that are fed by the incorrect reporting distortion or incorrect position or assessment of reporting. But yeah, it really leads to more problems. I mean, crime now has become a big political issue because a lot of the things, as you know, they call it now catch and release. And, police work very hard to catch a criminal. They get him and him or her, and 30 seconds later, they're released. And then those who are released go back and commit more crimes. Well, it's now being documented, the D.C. area being one of them.
Sure.
It's a big jump in violent crime over the past couple of years. And they had to go ties back into what emanated from George Floyd was, of course, the defund the police movement, which then took wave as a political issue, and where certain areas and politicians were basically advocating and in fact did start defunding police outlets. And another aspect, and this is why I say one of those issues, or when you get into media bias, there's certain issues that really trigger that bias by the media. And one of them is a consequence of the George Floyd thing. And again, without even getting into, trying to try that case per se, except that it was a white police officer and a black male, and reinforcing and there's going back many, many years where a lot of blacks will try to say that white police are biased in how they force the law, and that, this was an egregious example of it. And, it is sad, and there are cases where that happens. What they don't tell you, however, is that an overwhelming majority of police people are actually good, legitimate. They're out there trying to do their jobs, and they're doing their jobs in a tough environment. And the other side of that they don't tell you about that in terms of the racial component here is that more blacks are killed by other blacks than they are by whites. But that part, and this is not to affirm whites doing that, but that part of the story doesn't get told as much. And the black community and racial issues in particular, that's one of those issues that the national media, you want to get the national media going, well, you get them going on so-called racial incidents, whether it's George Floyd or even, just regular things that are happening every day. The racism, that's become a big political issue for anyone in the political debate. And somebody on one side being, and let's be candid here, this is mostly coming from Democrats, referring to, if you're conservative, oh my gosh, you're probably a racist.
Sure. You know, it's interesting because, you know, you would think, you know, realizing to your point about racism and how it is a very, very hot button issue, that you would think you'd want to be extra careful in making certain that you put out the right information so as not to send people into a frenzy and create all of this havoc that we have right now with the, you know, defund the police, and now we've got crime running rampant. We've got people walking in and shoplifting, and nobody seems to care. They just walk right out. You got a beautiful city like San Francisco that's just turned into a hellhole. The cops are pulling back because they're not getting any support. And there was something that I heard, and I mentioned in an article I had written for the American Spectator once. It's called 4 and 40. You know, I'm not saying all police officers do this, but it was something running around where you drive 40 miles an hour with all 4 windows up, meaning I don't see anything, I don't know anything, I don't hear anything. And so, you know, the effects of that, of this anti-police narrative, have just been devastating, because the one of the big aspects of policing, and I say that because of my background, is proactive policing. Because part of the job of the police is not just responding to crime, but preventing it, getting out there, paying attention to what's happening, not being afraid to approach people, to ask them what's going on, to basically prevent crime from taking place. Well, that's pretty much gone now. Now police are just reactive. They just respond to calls. Because if you go out there and you show any type of, I don't want to use the word aggression, but if you show any type of initiative to try to intercede, you know, you're immediately on camera, you're doxxed, your supervisors or the mayor of the city, you know, they just have that negative. And that's a result of, I think, all that bad reporting that we got ever since the George Floyd incident. And we're living with that right now. And so, yeah, I guess the question I have now for you, Bill, is going to be a tough one. So how do you put the toothpaste back in the tube?
That is a toughie. I think there are a couple of things that I would mention. Back to these polls I was talking, there's actually polling that's done where they actually have organizations that rate the different media outlets, and they rate them on a scale being liberal and some of the obviously MSNBC and et cetera being on the left, Fox News being on the right. And they actually have a lot of centrist organizations, as you mentioned, AP and others falling more into that category. But I think what I'm hoping to address your point is that I think people remember that I love the famous scene in the movie Network. You know, the TV newscaster gets all upset with what's happening, and he just says, you know, he does a big rant and rave about the problem, and he says, "I'm mad as hell, and I'm not going to take it anymore." And I think a lot of people are searching for, and this gets beyond just media coverage into the political system as well, and people are fed up with this type of reporting that leads, like you said, to even dangerous situations or even misrepresenting or false stories. And that leads to a political situation where people in the political process, the more extremist factions, take over the political parties. And the polling today suggests, I mean, and I've cited this and this is kind of the area I'm looking at, today's polling now has shown that for the first time in a long time, more people in this country are identifying themselves as politically independent than in recent polling days. So, and this is more than a majority of people. So, and in fact, also in line with that is the same polling is going in the Biden versus Trump scenario, and these same people are saying, we don't want either of them. So now what's starting to happen there, and this gets back to, is that this has given rise to a political group called No Labels, which has talked about getting their own candidate out there, especially if it becomes Biden versus Trump, and they tie into these polls we're citing. And No Labels presents itself as a bipartisan group, so they got top former Republicans and Democrats, but they're also committed to the idea of, rather than having these extremist viewpoints, that you work together to come to a consensus in more of a bipartisan way. So that's starting to happen a little bit more, even to that point now. Even I happened to catch a interview last week of Robert Kennedy. And, now Kennedy is one that's all of a sudden, he's now running as an independent. He was in the Democratic Party. And of course, you got the name and all that goes with that. But all of a sudden, Kennedy, because the Democratic Party basically kind of shut him out of being able to run directly against Biden they did away with the New Hampshire primary where he might have scored well. So he becomes an independent. So the point there is that he's all of a sudden starting to resonate in the polls so that people are looking for an alternative. And then
Sure.
as to the media coverage as well, is that I think there's more people out there, what used to be referred to as the silent majority. A lot of people actually do, in fact, seek out or watch something with media coverage that's more credible, that's more believable. And hopefully that trend starts to continue. And I've seen more evidence of it recently. The last Republican debate was done by outlets called News Nation, which is relatively small compared to some of the others, but it's coming. But they basically are presenting themselves as more in the middle, more moderate, more, both sides now kind of reporting. And I think that their debate actually was very well done and very well run. And they've got their shows, I've started noticing, are more in that line. So I'm hoping that more of that type of trend takes place. And I think back the parallel there is because some of this is going to get voiced in the political system in terms of who people are going to vote for or against, which of course also gets into the dynamic of biased coverage about those candidates and the whole incredible phenomena.
Sure.
Trump.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the polls are a perfect, measuring stick for people's frustrations. Look at the approval rating for Congress. It's at an all-time low because they're camped out. We've got camps now. We don't have cooperation. We've got camps, and the same thing with the polls on the media and their frustration with that. So perhaps that's a good sign that things will change. But I'll just go ahead and paraphrase Winston Churchill, where he said that basically America will get it right after they've exhausted every other option, and that seems to be what's happening here. I certainly hope that we can right the ship, but I just don't know at this point. It's interesting because we talked about the importance of media, and I think in one of our previous conversations we talked about when you have dictators and you could turn to Adolf Hitler or even more recently Saddam Hussein, and there's a plethora of those folks running around. One of the very first things they do when they eventually get power is control the media because they realize how important and powerful it is. So we just need to be mindful of that because you lose control of the media. It's difficult to wrestle that back, and you got to sort of go to the source and look at what's happening in some of our higher institutions. Look what's happening, and recently MIT and UPenn and some of the anti-Israeli rhetoric that they allow to, not rhetoric, I mean threats that they allow to happen on the campus. That's who's out there, and that's our young people are being educated at these types of institutions. So when they come out, there's a slant there, and like you said, we've all got a bias, and it's part of the human condition. But that makes it really a big challenge. So I certainly hope that the trend continues to your point that people are fed up and want to see something different. So we'll just have to, wait and see how that all plays out.
It's going to be it's going to take a while, I think, but I think part of it goes back to the political process. But to add to your points there, I mean, the Putin in Russia, I mean, basically he has excluded any kind of outside media coverage. It's all dominated by Russian, basically state-run media outlets, and the Russian people there, that's all they're exposed to. And so then all of a sudden, it's kind of like they don't really know any better a
Sure.
They think that what they're being fed is correct. So, but the good news with social media is it does allow for ways to penetrate that. I mean, again, using Russia as a little example, you got some of the social media outlets that the people can't access the mainstream media that they're getting on social media outlets. I think Telegram is one of the big outlets now that reaches a lot of Russian people. And, you go back to even back to the Cold War period, and, the whole the purpose of Voice of America was to get beyond the control of the Soviet countries, which are, there again, all state-run media. So it all does point to that. So, but I think, I'm hoping that the public, there is a true sense of, we're fed up with this and we're not going to take it anymore. And that starts becoming expressed more and more. But it's not going to be rolled completely back. I mean, just the whole use of Twitter, using that example, I mean, people get on, and this is one of the big things that causes all of this, is years ago, if somebody was upset about something somebody said, they would say, well, what public outlet did you really have to go to? I'll write a letter to the editor, and of course the letters to the editor may or may not get run as determined by the paper. Now they can just get on and give their viewpoint, often which is, totally off base and very, very slanted and biased. But I also know a lot of people don't go to Twitter now, or don't like using Twitter, to use that example, because they do see that. And they say, look, these people are either left or right. They're way out there, and I don't really want to take part in that.
Sure. No, I understand that. But I was recently reading, it was very disheartening to read it. I can't remember the exact percentage, Bill, but it was a fairly high percentage of young people who are getting their news from TikTok.
Oh, boy. Yeah. That's right.
Yeah. I mean, that's scary. That's frightening. And they're voters. They're people that will, eventually vote, and if not, they're able to vote right now. And you're getting the news from TikTok. That's very worrisome. But I think I agree with you that I think people are getting fed up. I think these things will run their course, because there's so many things that have run their course. I mean, it was all these statues. We need to tear down all the statues because they're offensive and everything else. And that happened for a few weeks, and then we got past that. And then it was another issue and another issue. So I don't know. I hope people just really, but I think my point is that I want people to understand, if, for the listeners on this particular program, that it just isn't bias. It just isn't, you interjecting your personal views into a story. That's part of it, obviously. But when you do it in such a way that it becomes dangerous, and people rely on that and then run with that, and the results are catastrophic, whether it's the police issue, or whether the situation you brought up in Israel that created that absolutely horrific world protest because of the supposed rocket that hit the hospital in Gaza, or any of the other issues that we deal with, the racism issue and things like that, that it really does matter what you say. And I'm somewhat disheartened that these major news organizations that are, supposed to be credible and have been around for a long time and know how to do it right, just seem to turn a blind eye to it.
Yeah, no, and to reinforce your point on TikTok, I mean, I was stunned when I first heard that, to the under 30 crowd.
Yeah.
And like you said, that was their number one news source. TikTok. And at that point, I'd heard of TikTok, and I said, well, okay, let me go check it out. And I thought, oh my gosh, this thing is crazy. It's entertaining, which is part of the appeal, but it's also, they have a perspective that they kind of weave in there, and it starts coming out. And the other dynamic with that, which also greatly concerns me, is that same under 30 crowd, the polls show that they are now more willing to embrace or approve of violence as a method of expressing their disagreement. And that's really scary.
Yeah, that's a frightening concept that somehow they've gotten indoctrinated to believing that that's the way to go. But I think that part of the solution goes to our institutions of higher learning, where we can turn the tide to making these institutions an open place for honest debate from both sides. That has been cut off. And so we have lots of our students attending these schools that are been indoctrinated rather than educated, and that they are the future. They come out of the schools and they become journalists and they eventually become editors. And so I think it's important that we go back to the schools, because I think we've not paid attention to that, to the indoctrination that's been going on for years now. It's just not something that just happened recently. And you can clearly see it with the demonstrations, with the pro-Palestinian. And again, we're not here to debate the plight of the Palestinians. That's another issue. And I'm not saying they don't have a cause. I'm saying that the indoctrination has really taken place here that has been really over the top. And I think if we have a chance of fixing it, we need to get at the source, and that is the indoctrination that some of our young people are going through with the institutions that they are attending. A perfect example is a situation in Stanford, where they invited a judge to come in and speak. He was invited, and yet the dean and the students shouted him down and wouldn't allow him to speak. And he got there by invitation. He didn't just show up. And so this is Stanford. I mean, this is one of our better institutions of higher learning that just showed an ugly side. I mean, you invite a judge to come in and speak to these, I guess, law students or whatever, and then the dean that was a part of the invitation process gets up and shouts him down and goes along with the crowd. It seems like our professors, the leaders in these institutions now just don't want to be. They just go along with the crowd. If the students are in that direction, they seem to want to follow that, and that's very dangerous, because you can see the ramifications of it. And I'm glad to see that some of these deans have been held accountable. I think recently the dean of UPenn had to resign because of the pressure and what happened there. So I think that's a good thing that shows there are consequences to just following the crowd mindlessly.
No, absolutely. And again, Harvard is another case. Again, she hadn't had to resign, but she was talking about it, and then a lot of people in the other faculty and the students have started coming up speaking for her. But yeah, there's been a lot of attention to that kind of thing. Well, I tell you one that really struck me, and I really was stunned when I first heard about it, because this gets into the whole wokeism and cancel culture. And don't get me started on that stuff. But, because it's part of the bias that's taking place. And the bias is one side, because cancel culture, wokeism, basically is primarily used against conservatives. Yeah. And a lot of this, the issues or the people, an example that happened recently that was really, Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin, a conservative Republican, but basically by and large considered, pretty moderate, and even ended and not considered one of the more, for lack of a better word, extremist type of politicians, and, real moderate in my view. But he was scheduled to speak at I think it was George Mason ceremony, the graduate ceremony. And the students there got a petition to disinvite him from speaking. And, even if he is arch conservative or whatever, why do you disinvite somebody if the university is supposed to be a place where you have diversity of viewpoints and let people speak, but they go in the opposite way? I hope that some of this was what you're saying with Penn and Harvard now kind of feed into people saying, well, that's absurd. It really is interesting if they could, they just said something about some other thing, like a racial dimension to use it. They've been okay. But, no, genocide and the Jews, well,
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
It's absurd.
It is. It is absurd, and it's just sometimes disheartening. And I think also, too, I mentioned our institutions of higher learning, but I think if you look at even, elementary school and junior high school, you can see the indoctrination creeping in there. So I think that's where we really need to, I guess you can say, put the line in the sand, so to speak, in making sure that all viewpoints are represented, that the schools they don't wind up indoctrinating our children instead of educating them. And I think that's where we need to really focus our efforts, because I suspect that once someone comes out and they're working at the New York Times or whatever, I mean, can you ever change that person back? Can they ever all of a sudden say, okay, well, I see the light now, I'm going to be an honest and fair reporter, get rid of all that other stuff? I don't think so. I think that we need to pay attention to what's going on and what's being taught in our schools, and make certain that our children are getting an education, not an indoctrination. So that's how.
Absolutely. And to that point, I mean, that's why it's become a political issue, very much a political issue in terms of the schools. And, there's a lot of dynamic. I mean, using Governor Youngkin again as an example, actually, he kind of surprisingly got elected because there was a movement. They said, "Oh my God, parents can't have a say into what their children are being taught," and it was kind of like, "We got to be kidding me, I can't do that." And now, this is another one of those issues. Don't need to get too sidetracked into it with the transgender issues.
Sure,
one of those type of issues here. So, and it also starts with the media reporting, because media kind of go into, like I said, there's certain issues that they are predisposed to be very favorable about, and the transgender issue is one of them. Another one.
Yeah. And again, to your point, we mentioned it earlier, it goes on both sides. It's not just a one-sided thing. I think clearly the bulk of the media is considered to be, in that mainstream media, and I think they are much more left, and I think the bias shows up more so. Not to say it doesn't show up on the right, but I think more so on the left. It's just
because again, I've seen in their polls. I think it's called All Sides Now, and they actually chart out the different media outlets, and they're a lot more on the left than there are on the right, but they're certainly out there on the right. I mean, anybody who watches Fox News, I mean, I'm a conservative, but Fox News is definitely a conservative overall. But Fox News does have some aspects, and this is where I take some part. There's a show on there called Media Buzz. Howie Kurtz, former media critic for the Washington Post, now works but he does it, now works for Fox News. In this show, he takes a look at both sides every week and critiques them. And I think that's the kind of thing, I say, that's the kind of thing that I want to see more of. And Kurtz really is very even-handed in what it is. But if you tell that to another liberal, they say, "Oh, he's on Fox News, he must be a right winger."
Yeah.
Wait a minute.
Sure, you're finished before you start, but and it's also too, it's not just things that affect the average Americans in terms of deciding who to vote for or whatever. When you have this bad reporting, this media bias, it creeps into our institutions. Not only school, but you look at, like, for example, over the years, I was a former federal agent. I worked with the FBI extensively, great people, great organization, but the confidence in that bureau has plummeted because of, I think as an after effect of media that was just wrong. And we could talk about the Trump situation and the Russia situation, and, for another 10 hours, I suppose. But that's an issue when this either media bias or false reporting, agenda reporting, I should say, creeps into our institutions, where it can really, really be a serious effect.
Oh, absolutely. And again, reinforcing your point there with the polls now, I mean, the FBI being a great example of that. I mean, they used to be viewed as, highly credible, if they're doing investigations, legitimate investigation. Well, now, because of all the different things that have come out of that, and a lot of people kind of view their investigations as being very politicized, and they go looking at the whole dynamic and with Trump and Biden and stuff, and there's a lot of that kind of the FBI directors and stuff, and others at the have been accused of being that way, and it's maybe not every single FBI agent that way, but some of the leadership has been that. But it does strike at the heart of credibility. And it's sad because there again, I think the public really wants an institution that's credible, that they can believe. And
100%. I couldn't agree more. And, you know, we could talk about this all day long with the Hunter laptop issue, which was a perfect example of them suppressing something they knew was true. And it was interesting because they had the FBI director on recently asking them about that because they knew it was real, but they wouldn't come out and say it. And he basically said, well, I didn't want to affect an election. And one of the senators that was questioning him said, we didn't ask you to tell us what was on it. We just wanted to know whether it was real or not. And they wouldn't even say that. So, maybe they had reasons for it, but it certainly doesn't pass the smell test when you see that happening. And it just feeds into this whole other thing of we're camped out. You know, we're just, there's media on this side, media on that side. We got, members of Congress on this side, members on that side, and we just cannot seem to find common ground on things anymore. And that's unfortunate. So, it's interesting. I don't want to leave this on a bad note because it's the holiday season. So I guess we can say there is hope. And I'm going to latch on to what you said, that you're seeing a trend move in that direction, because I want the listeners to not be depressed when and they watch the show, that there is hope. And I certainly think that eventually we will right this ship. But Bill, I really wanted to thank you for being on the show and to provide your insight, which was absolutely phenomenal, because I really wanted to get, your flavor of things, given your experiences as a journalist and in politics as well. So I want to thank you for being on the show.
And I greatly appreciate being invited. As we found out when we first talked about this back at Clyde's,
yeah,
he said, well, I said, I started talking about this and I said, hey, I can go all day.
Yes, you. Well, I can
leading it to people. I think more and more want that, but the other idea that's showing is they're being more aware of the bias to go look at something both on the left and the right
to get the ground truth. Yes, I couldn't agree more. It just takes more homework on the part of the average person now to dig through this. But I do have hope that eventually we'll right the ship and that people will want to go back to honest reporting. So anyway, I'd really want to thank you again, Bill, for being on the show. It was enjoyable for me. And so thank you very much. And if you like the show, please hit the like button and also hit the subscribe button. I would appreciate that. And also check out my YouTube channel page, where you can find a link to my book, The Great Bird of Baghdad, the true story of a missing Iraqi bioweapon scientist. You don't want to miss out on that. I'm Steve Monteiro. Thanks for joining.